Today we're back with part 2 of the tier list series, and now that we're getting into higher tiers, more relevant information is needed about a deck's relevancy. Information like how many hand traps a deck can run, how many hand traps can the deck play through, can the deck work with engines like Adventure, or something similar. These questions are going to be answered on most decks, although, spoiler, to answer the most of those is going to be similar, as we're in the casual tier. Let's start off with a few decks that I missed that fall into lower tiers. Iron Chain feels more like a collection of miscellaneous cards as opposed to a single archetype. This deck has two main focuses, either weak milling effects that get at most 3 cards or so, or mediocre burn effects. This deck is above Koitsu solely because it has Iron Chain Repairman, who has a graveyard revival effect. Gradius is a special summon from hand if you control a specific normal monster, as well as having an equip that does piercing, and it has a 300 attack gain. Honestly, not the worst thing ever. It's just so minimal it's not worth talking about. It sits next to Iron Chain. Monks are a battle phase destruction deck that use an equip and a spell to destroy monsters. It's very simple and that's really all it does. It has actual removal, so it's above the other ones, but still tier 0. Reactors are 5 monsters that burn your opponent when they play cards, but only once per turn. This deck does have a cool boss monster you can summon if you get the 3 smaller ones out, but its main effect is just a on-summon monster destruction. With no way of getting this deck's monsters out and an awful strategy for the most part, this deck is stuck in tier 0 as well. I bet you can see why I missed these decks on my first time through. Amazon are a really janky OTK deck, so in all honesty, I should have put this deck in tier 3, so I'm gonna retroactively do that. They have enough monster spam and searching to be considered a casual deck, but they lack an easy, effective end goal to get higher. Typically, the game plan is to search out monsters quickly, and special summon a bunch of them for free to either OTK with Amazon skills, make Naturia Beast, or do Link shenanigans to try to make Appaloosa. The fusion aspect of this deck is hard to get to, but the field spell provides great recursion. This deck feels pretty solid and casual, but so many older cards drag this deck's potential down. It would be a cool summon spam deck with battle phase abilities, but it hasn't quite got what it needs to. Once this deck gets its new support that got announced, you can probably move this deck up to casual. For Ignites, I've got some good news and I've got some very bad news. Good news is, Heat Waves still exist, and Skill Drain is now at 3. Bad news is, Master Rule 4 and 5 stop this deck from being better casually. This deck has good stun options, but you do have to go first. Also, I've seen a lot of decks for Ignites teching in a small Infernoble engine for some actual effects. Those builds lose Heat Wave, so I think they're actually worse. This deck is destroyed by Ash Blossom, although other hand traps don't do all that much against this deck. This deck was initially put at tier 4 when I did an overview of everything, mostly because I remember getting absolutely destroyed at a regionals by a man cold waving me back in 2015 or 2016. Can't remember when exactly. But this deck is just dysfunctional enough to deserve being knocked out of casual. Now on to the actual tier 4 decks. These decks have defined win cons and can often play through at least one negate going second. These decks are gate kept out of higher tiers, as they might have issues with hand traps, consistency, or they could just be really slow. This tier has been the hardest to rank from best to worst, but I believe it to be relatively accurate. Quite a few of these decks had nothing covering them in a serious light in the past few years, so I hope my suffering at trying to build the best variant of battling boxers is worth it to y'all. Naturia as a deck are held up by 2 things: Naturia Bamboo Shoot and Naturia Beast. The goal of Naturia is to figure out some method of getting them onto the board, then hitting your opponent with what are some of the genuinely best floodgates in the game on monsters. Typically, this deck is going to be paired up with an outside engine like a plant strategy, or as a unique stun deck utilizing these cards. Take Rock Stun, but with Naturia. This deck needs support, and the only thing holding it together are how many stun traps and hand traps you can fit into a Naturia deck. This is my saddest placement of a deck. I had thought the OCG support came out, and I was hyped to put it in a higher tier 4, but unfortunately, all we have right now is the classic Symphonic extra normal summon engine and the weird Symphonic field spell that builds up to a board wipe. The deck's not great as a deck right now, but it does pair really well at desk spots, so there's that. I'm mad I don't get to cover this deck with its new support. It's such a cool engine. But as it is right now, the deck is a great extra normal summon and doesn't really have an end goal, but you can make some pretty good extra deck shenanigans. Melodious are a deck. There are a lot of them. They're good at spamming themselves out to the field, but that's about it. This deck doesn't have great boss monsters, but the deck can just put out a lot of them. Typically, I see this strategy played as an OTK deck, mostly because this deck can't produce disruptions on its own. The deck's best cards lock you into Melodious cards. The deck cannot be played with the Adventure engine, but it can run a lot of hand traps. Here's a list I made for Melodious. Melodious don't like being paired with any outside deck despite needing it. This is about the best you can do. The deck is honestly not bad at OTKing once you understand its combo, but you're not getting really far. I'm retroactively moving up Super Quantles because, to be honest, I didn't read Melodious and I feel really bad. Tendangles are a very cool flip archetype that has a lot of solid options for how the deck can be built. However, the problem with this deck becomes immediately apparent. Unlike a deck like Subterra or Ghost Trick, Tendangles don't have a great way of flipping themselves up and often have to rely on another archetype of generic support going first. Either that or they just go for a set 2 monsters and pass type deal. What puts this deck outside of weak meta is really how well the deck recurs itself combined with powerful OTK options. Every Tendangle spell and trap, pulls out more value in grave, and every single Tindangle flip gets a massive value. Just know that this deck is reliant on how your opponent plays. Here are some neat text. Deus Ex Crawler gives the deck a boss monster and a strong negate in goal. Subterra Succession is fantastic in the deck. It has crazy synergy with Shadow, and Terrifying Toddler of Torment is good generic support for the discarding the deck likes to do. Heretic are a rank 8 deck revolving around tributing its monsters and specialing out a level 8 normal monster for free. This deck is incredibly dated. While the Heretic Links gives the deck a powerful disruption, it's not enough to bring the deck into modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Fully. This deck does have some solid removal options and can play very well with generic dragon support. Also, you can play this deck with an adventure engine. Surprisingly, since all the big monsters can special summon themselves out, this deck doesn't brick as much as you would expect. Lastly, this deck doesn't do great in hand traps. Gadgets are a dated core for a machine deck. Although, thanks to Silver Gadget, Gold Gadget, and Platinum Gadget, this deck has new life as a rank 4 machine engine. Red, Green, and Yellow Gadget have a simple effect of searching another gadget when they're summoned, and basically gadgets give you an incredibly long line of hand fodder for other engines. Surprisingly, this deck has angled well into working with train support and with extra normal summon engines like Symphonics. Here's a list I found showing off gadgets. Really keeps gadgets down here is how slow and costly their effects are to use. Using a normal summon counts a lot for most decks now. Jinzo is a weird one. If your opponent is playing a continuous trap deck like True Draco or Eldritch or anything trap related like Trap Tricks, your opponent is gonna have a bad time. This deck counters the trap mechanic entirely, but similar to a deck like Ally of Justice, it struggles to do anything outside of its niche. The deck has very good searches depending on what your opponent does, and has very solid field swarming as well. Luckily with infinite impermanence in the game, we can always depend on our opponent having a trap in deck. Here's a list I found for crazy people. My deck sense tells me that if this was refined, you might have a solid casual deck here. World Legacy is a really janky link spam deck. Typically most people don't realize that this is a full deck, and not just 2 to 3 cards you can run in Orcrust or Mech Knights. This deck lacks its own starters, but makes up for it by a pure build, synergizing with cards like Orchestrated Return and Trade-In to loop through your big monsters. Once this deck does get going, it has explosive combo potential from both the Ib Link monster and from stealing support from Orcrust. Honestly, this deck is a pretty fun strategy, but building with it more as a secondary engine, and focusing on either Orcust, Mech Knights, or Crusader, is needed to hit a higher tier. It can maybe work with the Adventure engine. Builds I've seen can fit around 6 hand traps, but the consistency of those builds is inconclusive. Time Lords is a boring to play stun variant, similar to Tindangle. This deck is dependent on waiting till your opponent's battle phase to activate their effects, but unlike Tindangle, these cards have some destruction protection and have synergy with better cards. Typically, this strategy is divided into 1 or 2 categories. A burn-centric list, abusing how this deck has effects that can half life points and burn, and the other style of list uses the other Time Lord effects that can disrupt your opponent. Both styles often abuse cards like Mystic Mine, Kaijus, and other stun effects to make the deck work. The deck also has access to the rank 10 extra deck, giving a backup plan or just extra burn damage. The deck can run quite a few hand traps, but as a stun variant, you have other priorities. Honestly, not an awful game plan if your opponent can't out Mystic Mine or doesn't have non-destruction removal. Sylvans have not aged well. This deck has always been a normal summon dependent deck, and basically every hand trap stops what this deck can do. If the deck is able to go off or gets lucky enough to play through 1 disruption, the deck can make a very solid 1 to 3 negate board. Outside of the starter and extender problem, this deck has a unique issue of not being able to run a large amount of non-plant monsters, because Sylvans require to be able to see plant monsters off the top deck to trigger skills. You can't run almost any hand traps because of this. Also, Gloat Ball being banned has kneecapped some of this deck's best plays. Here's a list I've made using the OCG only Sylvan Link monster. I haven't taken into account the OCG Link monster for this tier list, but even if I did, the deck's not coming out of casual tier. Battle and Boxers are a rank 4 spam deck that's a few monsters short of being a good engine. This deck is notable for having counter trap cards that stop your opponent from doing anything during the battle phase. But what really makes this deck stand out is how easy it is to summon the deck's main monsters. Battling Boxer Sparrow and Battling Boxer Shadow are just free level 4 special summons. This deck works very well with any one of the Utopia decks or with Infernoble support. Battling Boxers don't have a lot of restrictions, so the deck can go crazy. The deck can run the Adventure engine, but it can be cloggy with the deck's main strategy. Here's my list that I spent more time on than I'd like to admit. We're doing the Utopic combos, but with Battling Boxers to enable them, and using Battling Boxing XYZ monsters to OTK with. This list is a go second list, and I'll admit it's not perfect, but this deck shouldn't be counted out. You could fit a few more hand traps into this list, but you'd lose some of the Battling Boxer consistency. Fortune Ladies are a surprisingly good synchro spam deck. Now I know what you're thinking. Didn't we already cover Fortune Ladies last video? Well no, that was Fortune Fairies, which have a very different mechanic of summoning themselves when they are drawn. Fortune Ladies are a level manipulation summon spam deck. The deck has solid draw power thanks to Fortune Lady Water, and decent spam ability thanks to Fortune Lady Light and Fortune Lady Calling. This deck is based around using a generic lineup of synchro monsters, so like Baron LaFleur, Dawn Dragster, and Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, and using them to make common plays. This deck works very well with the Adventure engine, engine, but a lot of builds struggle to play through hand traps or struggle to main deck 6 hand traps. Here's a list that, despite being an absolute meme, shows off the deck's strengths very well. Someone better refine this list because it's a brilliant concept and I don't want to. Gimmick Puppets are a rank 8 spam deck. The deck has some solid normal summon options and fantastic extenders. The problem is the lack of a solid end goal. Typically this deck can make one generic rank 8 monster and one Gimmick Puppet rank 8 monster. That is unless you see a machine dupe. Then the deck gets crazy. This deck can flat out ignore some hand traps later in its combo thanks to Gimmick Puppet Terra Baby and can make a clean 1-2 negate board if it's lucky. Downsides to this deck is poor consistency and some of your best cards locking you into Gimmick Puppet monsters. Also, if this deck is hand trapped early, it can struggle a lot. Artifacts could have been so much higher on this list, but as a strategy where we're running the full package, the deck's main issues become very clear. The deck doesn't do a whole lot going first outside of setting 5, even if its main effects can be extremely powerful. The deck going first has to either rely on Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer or the Adventure Engine for an extra kick. Outside of that, Artifact Scythe does not have the same relevance against every deck you face. The deck also has to deal with its inability to go second easily as well. I'd describe the deck as insanely strong but insanely slow, and matchup dependent. Ash Blossom has hurt this deck's best card of Artifact Sanctum. Times have not been super kind to what was once 1/3 of the best deck in the game. Element Saber are a gimmicky control deck that's all about stalling with some monster disruptions and then blowing out your opponent with the Elemental Lord series of monsters and OTKing. Wait, scratch that. The field spell says to skip all next battle phase if we use the best effect. So close to having a cool one-set archetype. But this deck does have some powerful blowouts, such as a Regeki, Harpy's Feather Duster, and some discarding from our opponent's hand, as long as you skip your battle phase, preventing you from closing out a game that should have been won. Also, the deck's 2 best main deck monsters have a quick effect Book of Moon and a spell and trap negate, so this deck isn't unplayable, it's just forced into being incredibly slow by a pointless restriction on a field spell. Simorgh are a winged beast tribute deck that has some fantastic searchers and are able to summon out monsters through the board incredibly quickly. Unfortunately for the deck, their best card of Simorgh Bird of Sovereignty is banned. Thanks, Tri-Brigade. Speaking of which, Tri-Brigade still works as a fantastic engine for the deck. Even if you can't make a free barrier statue anymore, Tri-Brigade still give access to the full combo. The deck can also tech in Harpy's Featherstorm for an easy go first play. The downside to this is that all the Simorgh engine does outside of putting monsters on the field is make a spell and trap negate, or you can trade that spell and trap negate for a rank 8 play. But it's not great. Being able to spam summon monsters and work with Tri-Brigade does easily put it into the casual tier though. Archfiend are a weird monster spam deck. What makes them relevant is their ability to use generic Fiend support as their main driving support. This can mean stealing a BA engine or Tour Guide, or even Edge Imps. The deck can put out monsters to the field in OTK easily enough, but the deck is dependent on generic extra deck monsters like Chaos, Ruler, or Beals. Most I've seen aren't able to properly run a lot of hand traps, but they can play through 1 or 2 with the right hand. Did you know Golden Castle was a deck outside of it being a tech for Grand Maju? It's not meta, but it does have some cool stuff going for it. Basically, the deck is all about 1-card monster lines, how they make cool link plays or XYZ plays. The deck has easy access to removal thanks to Hexatrude, and has easy access to its field spell thanks to Gilf to Phantom Bird. This deck can easily fit in a lot of hand traps, and it works pretty well with the Adventure Engine. If the deck had its own extra deck or negates, it would be a lot higher than it is. As of right now, it's like opening a bag of Lay's chips. It's mostly empty. Magic Key are a really cool concept, just missing out on a few key support cards to really push them towards an end goal. They have a monster negate on a Ritual monster, access to Evolve Sword on Dolkia and Lagia, and a counter trap, spell a trap negate, that also changes your opponent's monster's attributes. This deck is pretty good, it just doesn't play the best around hand traps, and it lacks finishers and recursion. Several key effects depend on what attribute or monster your opponent summons, and that can be awkward to play around. The deck can regularly play through about 1 hand trap, but the quality of plays drop if the normal summon gets negated. If this deck got a few more cards or normal summon monsters got new support, this deck might see some relevancy in the future. Also, this deck can't work with the Adventure Engine, and it doesn't have a lot of room for hand traps, as it needs to run some normal monsters and have a ton of consistency cards for the ritual aspect. Mechlord is a different strategy than the much better Earth Machine strategy. This strategy is all about Mechlord Nucleus Infinity, Core Nucleus, as a 1-card setup for this deck's free spell negate. That as well as Mechlord Army Deployer Obligado, being able to pull out 2 free non-negated Mechlord Army monsters from deck. Although every Mechlord Army monster is awful, this can still be very powerful. This deck plays very well with Gizmex and the Theron strategy for an easy 2-negate board. This deck can somehow run 9+ hand traps due to how streamlined the Mechlord engine can become. The Mechlord engine deals with hand traps similar to how Invoke does, although outside extenders need to be hard drawn in to do that. Honestly, Mechlords are a solid casual choice for you anime fans. Gradle are a wacky anti-meta pick. Well, say anti-meta, but more so anti-everything. The deck is all about having your monsters destroyed, and then using your monster effects to steal your opponent's monsters. This deck almost is exclusively paired with the Kaiju strategy. Although Kaijus are technically on another part of the tier list, they're either used as removal techs in other decks, or as another half to the Gradle Kaiju strategy. These 2 decks are the first really intertwined strategies that are on this list, although there are quite a few more. Kaijus allow Gradles to use their effects uninhibited, and the Gradle strategy weirdly plays around hand traps, and it's one of the key reasons why this deck has not fallen into the lower tiers. Although this deck can work with the Adventure Engine, you might not have a lot of room left for hand traps if you do that. Kaijus technically have a few more available options than just with Gradles. Although all of these other variants that actually commit to a full Kaiju strategy still have the same problem as Gradle Kaiju. Kaijus let us tribute over an opponent's monsters and special summon our own Kaijus. Our own Kaijus let us remove Kaiju counters to activate some pretty decent effects. Kaijus are inherent summon, letting them go off against any deck, and they have pretty strong effects. The problem is, Kaiju counters are gained from interacting with your opponent's stuff. This means a deck that can quickly power through a board will just run through Kaiju's entire strategy. Also, Kaijus can't do much of anything going first. The Adventure Engine does work with this deck, although you won't have a lot of room for hand traps if you run that. This tier list has been brought to you so far by Inherent Summoning. It just happens. Fleur is a surprisingly good synchro spam engine that happens to also be Noble Knight cards, so the deck can steal support from them. This is the second, but not the last, unrelated archetype that happens to be Noble Knight support. Basically, this deck is all about making Baron LaFleur some other generic win cons. This can either be Auroradon shenanigans, or simple Verte Anaconda in the DPE, or Red Eyes Dragoons. This deck is very vulnerable to a hand trap at the right moment that can run 6+ hand traps within its engine. I've seen lists combining this deck with everything from Dogmatica to Dark Synchro to generic machine support. Ninjas are an incredibly slow control deck. Think Trap Tricks, but with no Link 1s. The goal of this strategy is to use the main deck ninja monsters to set up ninjutsu traps. The downside to these traps is that they're continuous, so yes, MST would negate the deck's main cards. The deck does have a field spell to give their traps protection, but it doesn't do a whole lot else. If their main ninjutsu resolves, they can summon out an Amorphage monster from the deck to lock the opponent out of special summoning. If you don't mind playing a worse variant of 2016 Trap Tricks, then this deck is for you. Here's a list I found showing a trap-heavy build of the deck. At least this deck can fit in hand traps. Crawler are the highest rated deck that focuses purely on flipping during the battle phase. It's an unfortunate mechanic to be stuck with, even if it's the best at doing it. On its face-up monsters, Destruction can give the Crawler a special summon 2 out of the deck. If the deck can survive a turn, then this deck can fully pop off, and OTK using its own links, and to support the deck takes for more legacy. However, that's a pretty big if. Crawlers is a super vulnerable to hand traps and destruction until they can get their boss monster Deus Ex Crawler. Crawler can work with the Adventure Engine and with engines like Tindangle and B-Trooper. I'm gonna be quite honest with you. I don't know where to place Ojamas. They're not good, but they have funny synergy with more archetypes than they deserve. We have Paleozoic Ojama, ABC Ojama, Dark World Ojama, Eldritch Ojama, and Branded Ojama. All of these decks don't gain anything from Ojama, but Ojamas don't do anything on their own either. Basically, this deck benefits off generic discards and can spam summon a bunch of little guys for neat link plays, weird monster zone locks. Either way, this deck is stuck in casual hell. I'm sure that in a year, this deck will get another card of support that gives this deck a completely random, pointless effect that will enable the deck to work passively, although not well enough to matter in another random archetype. It should be noted before I forget, the biggest problem with Ojamas is that they're extremely bricky. Here's a Despia Ojama list that I think is very cool. It doesn't meet the requirements to be an Ojama deck for the tier list, but I think it's better that way. Armed Dragon is a really janky OTK deck. The goal is simple. Climb through the levels of Armed Dragons, and through one method or another, special summon out Armed Dragon Thunder level 10. Then with a bunch of large attack beat sticks, wipe out your opponent's board and attack for game. Downside is, that's all the deck can do, and it doesn't play well into hand traps. Hand running quite a few level 5 or higher monsters can be quite bricky. The deck does have multiple ways to summon Armed Dragons straight out of the deck and out of hand. Here's a list I found for Master Duel, and with a few changes to account for the ban list difference, this deck can work pretty well, and it shows how to use generic dragon support in an Armed Dragon list. Surprisingly, the deck Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon was created for is one of the worst decks at utilizing it. Mecha Phantom Beast are about token generation and Synchro XYZ plays. Problem is, Mecha Phantom Beasts don't have a built-in way to get 2 main deck monsters on the field at the same time. Luckily, we can use generic machine support and engines to start Mecha Phantom Beast plays instead. The Deckspot engine is a fantastic starter, the Gadget engine lets the deck make Auroradon as well, and the Windlich engine makes a free Crystal Winged Dragon. Basically, the end goal of the deck is to do Auroradon combos for synchros. The entire Mecha Phantom Beast deck outside of that is really dated. It doesn't play through hand traps well, unless the hand gets super lucky. Here's a list I found that shows all the hoops the deck has to jump through, and how cool the combos can be when it does work. Boojins are somehow just about the second least popular deck I've covered so far. That's because Boojins are a stall XYZ spam deck that has always been a bit too slow and extremely passive. Boojins are all about giving their own monsters protection with their engrave effects. They work incredibly well with Tri-Brigade thanks to its typing, and have little issue with running the Adventure Engine. However, Boojin lacks interruption on your opponent's turn from their own engine, outside of one very powerful Floodgate trap. Boojins also have a large portion of their effects that activate at the end phase, making the deck slower than it should be. Boojins also can't protect against non-targeting destruction removal, which is all too common in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Susunoa can provide easy board pressure and some value. Boojin Kagamusha has synergy with the Tri-Brigade engine through its mill 5 on summon. Here's my list. The deck can't run a lot of hand traps due to how many engines it runs, but a slower build could fit in more hand traps at the cost of power output. This is one of my favorite decks to play in testing. It's quite fun. Chronomaly are a surprisingly powerful spam XYZ deck. They should be a super dated strategy. Thanks to the newer wave of legacy support and how this deck can function as a starting engine for Emancipator, the deck is able to make some truly ridiculous boards. What makes this deck unique is the ability to recur its best monsters from grave by locking yourself into Chronomaly, as well as a strong trap that can special summon true Chronomaly monsters anywhere and immediately make an extra deck XYZ monster who is usually going to be a rank 5 with the monster negate. What hurts this deck a lot is how it can struggle to go through 1 or 2 hand traps depending on his hand, and consistency is a problem. Here's my list. If this was Master Duel while Block Dragon was at 3, there's a build of this deck that exists that you could put into a low tier 6, but as it is in the TCG, it's stuck at casual levels as the worst Emancipator deck. Lavavel are a crazy wombo combo deck based around 3 cards: Molten Conduction Field, which can send 5 cards from deck to graveyard, Rekindling, which can revive 5 monsters from graveyard, and Searing Firewall, which can make up the 5 tokens by banishing monsters from graveyard. I bet you can see where this is going. The deck could spit out inboards with Appaloosa, Nightmare Griffin, Borlode Savage Dragon, and Lavavel X-Lord at a tiny cost. Problem is, the deck literally does almost nothing if you don't see 2 of the main spells. It's not a great spot to be in, as the deck bricks like 40% of the time. Here's my list where I improved that consistency at running Left Arm Offering. As you could see, things are quite dire. I do genuinely recommend this deck to anyone who loves stupid, pointless combo decks. Honestly, if the deck got a little more in the starter category, this deck could be something competitive. As it is right now though, it's just too bricky to do anything. Noble Knights are an XYZ spam deck that has been given a lot of great tools, yet still has little disruption set up when going first. Basically, this deck uses cards like Noble Knight Madrat, Noble Knight Custinian, and Noble Knight Brothers to special out monsters for XYZ summoning, losing Noble Knight Yvonne and Isolde of the Two Tails for Noble Knights to link climb into Appaloosa. I will briefly mention that this deck has fantastic searching. What keeps this deck out of the higher tiers is that its XYZ monsters do nothing on your opponent's turn, and the deck's best summoning tools lock you into only summoning Noble Knights from the extra deck, and their starters often require you to have no other monsters on the field. Builds that heavily tech into the Infernal engine and play around this somewhat, but the 2 engines don't play nice together, as Infernal Knights need fire monsters to play. Consistency is also an issue. The deck has its own hand trap that can interfere with some of the deck's best plays. Also, this deck does not work with the Adventure engine, despite the Adventure engine having a card that mentions Noble Arms. I believe this is the 4th extra Noble Knight card that isn't a Noble Knight card. Frog the Jam is having a fucking stroke right now. Ritual Beast are a pre-hand trap wombo combo deck that once upon a time got hit on the ban list for being able to search out 2 monster board wipes somewhat consistently. Now this entire deck is lucky to get its combo started, as 1 interruption can stop the deck in its tracks. Consistency has gotten a lot better for this deck with cards like Win the Wind Charmer, and thanks to Dimensional Shifter, this deck can run one of the best hand traps. Typically, I see this deck paired with either generic Psychic support or Wind Witches. Here's my friends list that I think is pretty good. The deck can typically run about 6+ hand traps. Star Seraphs are the battle and boxer strategy, but significantly better. What you lose in being able to summon XYZ monsters with 2 materials, you make up for it in a much better engine. That's Seraph's gimmick, by the way. It's summoning XYZ monsters with 3 materials. Good news is, the deck works extremely well with the new Utopia and Go-Go-Go support, similar to how battling boxers do. The deck can play around hand traps pretty well, and it's able to run about 9 hand traps itself. The deck can't really work around the Adventure engine, but it can do some fun plays to make number F0 Utopic Draco Future, as well as number C104 Umbral Horror Masquerade, who to this day is still one of my favorite cards. Here's a list I found that's pretty solid. I trade the traps for hand traps, but it shows off the spam summoning the deck can do very well. Exodia is the funny stall FTK deck that everyone hates but pretends to like because it's a classic anime deck. There are 2 distinct builds to this deck, either the FTK card draw spam or stall variant, with most new ones focusing on Crooked Cook. Crooked Cook is a monster unaffected by card effects, will control no other cards, and the Shark engine gives it battle protection. The FTK variant is notoriously inconsistent outside of Master Duel, but more importantly, it's so unbelievably vulnerable to Ash Blossom or Droll Lockbird, I would have to put that at tier 3 or 2. However, thanks to the power of Crooked Cook, the stall variant of Exodia, the win con quickly becomes viable, especially in a casual format. Not only can the deck effectively find Exodia, it can also turbo out losing your friends. If you're looking for Crooked Cook as a strategy to be ranked on this list, I would consider it to be about here. Dream Mirror are an unfortunate gimmick deck revolving around switching field spells to activate different monster effects. What this deck does is use its entire hand to get a bouncer destruction and maybe a monster negate. Unfortunately, the deck needs to use its easily hand-trappable cards to set up its gimmick, making the deck unreliable in a more competitive setting. While this deck does make good inboards, it needs extenders and could use some more consistency or some cards to make the main engine smaller. Ultimate Athletes are simple. Make Disruption with UA Player Manager and UA Perfect Ace, or as he's known in Germany, Perfect Ace, while using UA Hyper Stadium and UA Libero Striker for setup. When it's time to go for game, make UA Dreadnought Dunker and equip him with UA Power Jersey. This deck is very simple and very strong if it goes off. Despite having some good disruption, UAs are very light on starters and extenders, and the deck is kind of vulnerable to hand traps. Rikas need a lot of help. They're a plant Plant XYZ deck that focuses around the gimmick of tributing monsters for better effects. On one hand, it lets their boss monsters get disruption through tributing, which is extremely strong, but on the other hand, it stops the deck from getting value, which it really needs to easily make more than one boss monster a turn. The deck has a Widow Anko trap and a whole lot of built-in recursion. Combining this deck with another plant deck such as a Romage, Sunvine, or Trap Trick can help fill in some of the deck's weak spots. Although, once hand traps come into the mix, this deck isn't going to be doing much more than making one disruption rank 8 and setting some cards going first. I do think Rika Kreen Strenna, who can honor tribute, special summon any rank 5 or higher plant XYZ in the extra deck, has potential for a lot of abuse. This is where I'm going to introduce a concept about support for decks. A lot of strategies are sitting at a point before hitting critical mass. What I mean is that for strategies like generic plants or dark magicians, they're going to keep indefinitely getting new support. And at some point, there'd just be enough of it to make the deck meta, or at least rogue. That's what happened to Dragon Link. Rika are in this boat with plants. A Sun Avalon engine gives plants another starter, the Rika XYZ gives a good boss monster, and the new Sylvan Link is a broken extender. The plant tuners are all cracked, Lone Fire Blossom and Arome's Jasmine are crazy for consistency. Eventually, Konami's going to print 1 or 2 cards that accidentally make all these diverse parts come together for at least a rogue deck. Maybe not this format, but mark my words, it'll eventually happen. As the saying goes, give enough monkeys typewriters for long enough, and eventually they'll make a Blue Eyes deck relevant. Black Rose or Rose Princess is a synchro spam deck that's all about setting up to make a Rudy Rose Dragon on the opponent's turn, just ruin your opponent's day on their turn. Despite having some cool combos, the deck does struggle a bit with hand traps. Luckily, this deck can almost always make a Black Rose Dragon going second through light disruption, as well as usually being able to set up a Cross Rose Dragon going first through at least one hand trap. Really, this deck's biggest problem is having its field nuke forced out early. It's got a very solid deck, just short for a few disruptions, or more ways to play through disruptions. Witchcrafter or a Recursion combo deck that's all about going neg-2 to summon out monsters from the deck. The problem with this deck is how it crumbles completely to hand traps, and has to basically discard its entire hand for combos. The trade-off is that at the end of the turn, if you haven't activated your Witchcrafter spells, you can add them back to your hand. The deck has some strong boss monsters and a discard 1 spell to negate all your opponents as monsters, as well as a discard 1 spell pop 1. Here's what my list looks like before they get their next wave of OCG support. Yes, I'm smoke screening Sky Strikers. No, you can't stop me. Here's what the list looks like after they get their new wave of support. Once that happens, the deck jumps up to low tier 5. Gishki are a very dated ritual deck. Once upon a time, they used to have a very consistent hand loop that made them banlist worthy. This, of course, stopped being a problem once hand traps came into the game, but the deck still has a lot going for it. Synergy with generic water support, synergy with other ritual support like Diviner of Herald, Incantation, or just Drytron. What really keeps this deck from being higher is that the deck lacks a solid win con. Ivagishki Gust Kraken, who's responsible for this deck's hand loop, isn't enough anymore. This deck can't make negates on its own, and the deck has to luck out for its best removal options. This deck struggles to play through disruption a bit too much to be higher. Here's a list pairing the deck with Drytron. Digital bugs are slept on because unfortunately their main gimmick of battle position manipulation has never been good and it's too hard to play around. Luckily, thanks to all the generic insect support from Bee Troopers and Battle Wasps, this deck's secondary playstyle of spamming out level 3 insect monsters becomes ridiculously easy. What digital bugs do on their own is summon a quick effect monster pop that can do piercing damage, and turbo out Cicada King. This deck can summon Beetroop or Scout Buggy out from the deck with Digital Bug Centrobit. This deck has enough outside extenders to play through hand traps very well, although the deck isn't great going second. This deck can play the Adventure Engine very well. Here's what my Digital Bug list looks like. Take advantage of both Cicada King's effect and our Digital Bug's effect. I'm running Earthquake to trigger their effects turn 1. Another example of way to abuse this would be with Level Limit Area B to reuse the effects. Ghost Tricks are an incredibly dated opponent's battle phase flip deck with a few cool but hard to set up blocks. Thanks to the newer support, any rank 3 monster becomes 2 Ghost Trick Angel of Mischiefs and a Search. This can either make number F0 Utopic Draco future, or you can leave those monsters face up to meet the requirements for this deck's other disruptions. Cards like Ghost Trick Fairy are a Book of Moon and a Revival option at the same time. Ghost Trick Neko Musume is a Book of Moon Floodgate for level 4 higher monsters. That is, if you control another face of Ghost Trick monster. This deck also has fantastic synergy with the Adventure Engine, as Water Enchantress is a level 3. What limits this deck is how hard the engine is to get started. This means that, unfortunately for this deck to work, most of its cards need to basically be generic rank 1 or 3 monsters, spam to make turn 1 plays. Also, this deck is extremely vulnerable to hand traps. Here's my list for Ghost Tricks for the current format. This list is able to fit in 8 hand traps, but a slower list can fit up to 20, albeit a lot of them being Ghost Tricks awful battle phase hand traps. I learned scrap combos for this video. I had to be thorough. Scraps are a wombo combo deck that can make crazy boards thanks to this deck not restricting link summons, as well as not having hard once per turn effects on some of the best cards. Scrap Wyvern turns any 2 scrap monsters into full combo, and Scrap Raptor and Scrap Recycler are some crazy starters. The deck is able to search its key cards with Fossil Dig and Scrapyard. However, if your opponent knows how to hand trap this deck's combo, the engine can fall apart completely to one hand trap. This deck can't run powerful engines like Adventure, and usually opts not to run a lot of hand traps to play Crossout, Designator, or Called by the Grave. If you like Glass Cannon combo decks, this is for you. I do have to mention that the best way to play this deck is as 4 cards in a Dino deck. It doesn't count for scraps on the tier list, but as a Dino deck, it's the best use of the engine. Evolsaurs aren't as good as Dino Mush, but the strategy is surprisingly solid as a casual deck. Basically, when Evolsaur monsters are tributed, they can special out Evolsaur monsters from the deck. This will probably be done through the Evo Force or through Evoltile Mega Chinarella. This is on top of a generic Dino engine, but what's really cool about Evolsaurs is that you can reload the broken Dinosaur XYZs, Evolsaur Dolka and Evolsaur Lagia, after they use their effects. Also, this deck is stupid consistent because you could search your entire deck thanks to both Fossil Dig and the Evolsaur Searcher, Evo Diversity. Really, the only thing keeping this deck from being better is that Evolsaurs are super hand trappable as a Dino starter and don't produce crazy inboards as a mush build like the one shown with Scraps. Karakuri are an Earth Machine Synchro Spam deck with the gimmick of every Synchro monster summoning a Karakuri from the deck as well as gaining value from changing battle positions. Unlike digital bugs, however, Karakuri have effects outside of changing battle positions, and have searchable cards that change those battle positions. What's more, with Karakuri is how effectively Karakuri are able to work with generic Earth machine support, such as Machina or Infinitrack. This gives what should be a fragile combo deck some much needed extenders and just an overall consistency boost. This deck can make inboards with 3+ negates, however, its consistency and vulnerability to hand traps keep the deck down. Here's a list I found. The deck cannot play the Adventure Engine, but it can fit a surprising amount of hand traps. Gunkan Sue ships are, wait, look at that, on the ship, it's an XYZ Jin. They're mad everyone forgot about them, so they stole another archetype to make OTK-oriented XYZ extra deck plays with. They got the Navy! Sue ships are about spam summoning themselves on board. They're getting effects based on what monsters are used to summon them. Particularly, the normal monster Susip Shari. This deck's pretty simple. Make a few extra Z-monsters than OTK. The field spell gets some battle protection and sets up some combos. Outside of that, the deck is really basic and simple. The deck is so non-restrictive, it works really well with other engines like Adventure, Time Thief, or Utopic. The downside to this deck is that it doesn't do a whole lot going first, and consistency isn't as perfect as the main deck only has 3 different monster pieces and no way to really search them. Here's a cool deck list mixing the deck with Time Thief to help it go first. Satellite Knights are an XYZ spam deck that's, despite having some issues with starters and playing around hand traps, it has some solid tricks and disruptions up its sleeve to keep it relevant at least casually. A standard Satellite Knight combo is about chain summoning Telok Knights from hand and grave to make rank 4s. The problem is, only one of them lets you chain summon from hand, so the deck takes some extra something to set up its plays. The deck can take advantage of mini engines from Zephyr to Fire Warriors to compensate for this, but it's an imperfect solution either way. To play around a negated summon, this deck can use Satellite Knight Skybridge to extend the combo. The deck's key disruptions come from Satellite Knight Trevere, being able to rip a card from the opponent's hand and bounce the rest of the board on summon. Satellite Knight Constellar Diamond stops cards from being sent from deck to grave, and is able to negate a dot monster's effect. Dark Tellarknight Beltimaeus makes all monsters on the field dark and lets us summon any other Tellark Knight from the extra deck. This is possible as a quick effect if we have 7 or more different Tellark Knights in grave. Here's a list I found pairing the deck with Zephyr. The deck is extremely close to being playable at a higher level. It just needs another Tellark Knight main deck starter to start its combos easily. As of right now, it's a very solid pick for casual games. Sunvine are a Plant Link spam deck revolving around a normal monster. Honestly, I'm already tired of seeing the single normal monster gimmick, and I think this is like the 3rd time covering it on this tier list. But Sunvine makes a big board with 1 monster negate and a Plant Link. There's an all monster negate trap and a bunch of battle protection. Not a bad end board, but it lacks punch and the main combo is very fragile if you hit it with a hand trap at the right time. The good news is, these decks' main engines are very small and it has a lot of starters. Unexpected Die, Rescue Rabbit, and Sunvine Sewing give this deck a lot of flexibility. Here's a list I found that shows off this deck's flexibility and combo potential. Mayakashis are a generic zombie combo deck. The deck focuses on making big synchro monsters and links that get effects when a card is summoned from their grave or when an opponent destroys them. This deck makes these with easy spam of Yukioh, the Ice Mayakashi, and Hajun, the Wing Mayakashi. Despite the ease of summoning, this deck's big monsters and the deck's end goal seem kind of bad, but then if so, why is it on the tier list? That's because this deck plays nice with every other zombie deck in the game. Be it Eldritch, Zombie World, or Shiranui, this deck can become an easy engine for these decks to pop off. While this deck can lose to any graveyard interaction, it can play through other hand traps very well. Whenever this deck gets a trap card from the OCG, as well as the new zombie support, I'd move this deck up to tier 6. Vendreads are in a very similar boat to Mayakashi. While Vendread monsters do a little bit more and have stronger end boards, they don't have an easy time getting to their end goals, despite some of the deck's monsters being fantastic for link fodder. Vendreads work by having its ritual monster gain effects depending on whatever ritual monster is tributed. Downside is, those monsters need to be on the field for that ritual monster to gain an effect. Vendread Core is a fantastic link spam, but a mediocre ritual effect. Vendread Revenants is the worst summoning effect, but has the best ritual effect. And Vendread Battlelord can turn off hand traps. The problem is, the ritual portion of stack as a lead strategy is too inconsistent, and the link spam this deck can pour off is a little too under-effective and easily disruptible for the current format. Here's my list for Vendreds. This is not remotely optimized, but I'm still mad that Grass Looks Greener got banned, so sometimes I like to pretend. If you want a good version of this deck, either play it with an Eldritch Engine or Drytrons. Red Eyes are an unfortunate case of anime support. It keeps endlessly getting support, but none of it really helps the deck or fixes the main problems. The anime says Red Eyes is potential, but it's kind of like Guru releasing Krillin's potential in Dragon Ball Z. But to be much more specific, Red Eyes struggles from not having a coherent core strategy. The deck has excellent pieces like Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, Red Eyes Fusion, Black Metal Dragon, and of course, the extremely strong Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. But Red Eyes don't have a great way of putting monsters onto the field outside of Redstone of Legend. This leads to Red Eyes falling into use in one or two strategies. The first is as a small engine in Dragon Link decks. This build honestly works fine, but it's not really a Red Eyes strategy, so it doesn't count for Red Eyes on the tier list. The second kind of Red Eyes deck, seeing maximum relevance, is one where the strategy is thinned down. This means just running Red Eyes Fusion and a few other pieces. This isn't awful, but it's bricky, and Red Eyes Fusion doesn't work with any other engine. Red Eyes strategies have some searchability and flexibility, and a bit of power, but they're missing a solid core to bring this deck to higher tiers like it should be. Shiranui are a zombie synchro OTK deck with the unique gimmick of getting effects when they're banished. Shiranui have great synergy with every other zombie archetype, but also work fine on their own. Shiranui Solitaire is the deck's best card, being able to tribute a zombie monster, to special summon out Unizombie out of the deck. He turns himself into a 1-card level 8 synchro, a rank 4 monster. Shiranui have incredibly strong recursion as a zombie deck, and you do crazy things like synchroing from the graveyard, and the trap, Shiranui's style Swallow Synthesis, is a broken, flexible, stuttered pop 3. The Shiranui engine can be cut down to 19 cards, so you can run a lot of hand traps. What keeps this deck from being good is how often it can whiff its own OTK, as well as some issues getting hand trapped. Shiranui Solitaire is one of the easiest ashables and impermeable cards, making the deck risky to play at times. Here's my list. It's a Go Second variant, adding in the Shadal engine as another starter. Funnily enough, this deck is what I play in paper most often. I usually substitute out Lightning Storm with Dark Ruler no more. Before I move on, I'm going to mention Ash Blossom being a fire zombie, which has unintentional synergy with Shiranui's. It's not a whole lot, but you can technically say that Ash Blossom is best in a Shiranui deck. Cosmos are a slow control deck that's all about having smaller monsters tag out into big untargetable monsters with destruction effects or negate. Then when those big monsters are destroyed, they pull out other monsters from the deck. This deck really only struggles from two things. One, only being able to tag out the little monsters into cards from hand, as well as only being able to get out one monster on the field outside of a lucky emergency call or the Fire King engine. The deck's effects are strong, but it's not enough to keep up with modern decks that move at Mach 10 through the 1 or 2 disruptions Cosmo can make. The plus side to playing this deck is that it can run a lot of hand traps, do an okay job at playing through them. The deck's in a weird kind of unfortunate spot, especially with how common non-targeting, non-destruction removal is. You can play this with Fire King for some better plays at the cost of consistency. Also, Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer works very, very well with the deck. Yosenju are a toxic, mean stun deck, or an awful janky pendulum deck that has the spirit drawback of bouncing themselves back to hand at the end of turn. The best variant of Yosenju is the stun deck. This takes advantage to the fact that Yosenjus can chain normal summon themselves out to field. This deck peaked with Vanity's Emptiness, but now the deck just abuses lose one turn, Torrential Tribute and Dimensional Shifter and the Banish Boys. The deck can reuse Kaijus thanks to Yosenju Kama number 2. Here's my list. The extra deck isn't what's important, so I didn't make one. If you go first with this deck, you're likely to win outside of a stray Lightning Storm. Baby Raccoon or level 2 Beast spam surprised me with how surprisingly good they are. This deck has a perfect synergy with Tri-Brigade. Tri-Brigade gives this deck another line of play when the Beast engine either bricks or gets hand trapped, which unfortunately does happen a lot. This deck makes crazy inboards that can make Materia Beast or Fabled Unicorn on top of a full Tri-Brigade combo. Whenever the deck needs to OTK, the deck can make number 64 Ronin Raccoon Sendeyu for easy numbers. If this deck wasn't so bricky, it could easily make it in tier 5 or 6. With how many dated cards it run, it can be very difficult to consistently carry you through an entire event. Windups are a Wombo combo Glass Cannon deck who between having their best extender and enabler on the ban list, and only really ever having 3 good main deck monsters, is having quite a rough time despite how much potential the strategy has. Wind up special out monsters directly from the deck if they can get started. The deck does have Wind Up Hunter available. For some reason, it's off the ban list, so hand looping 1 to 2 cards from our opponent's hand is a possibility. However, the deck is just bricky. There's no way around that. In like half of the decks in the tier, it's a pre-hand trap deck, so playing around Disruption isn't a guarantee. In fact, I'd say this is one of the worst Glass Cannons in this tier at playing through Disruptions. But it does definitely earn its spot thanks to hand looping and multiple negate boards. Appliancers surprised me by being so high on the list. They're a small engine, but they can genuinely make some insane link plays. Apollosa Nightmare Griffin can be spammed out by this deck in seconds. Gizmek Naganaki, the Sunrise Singler, is an excellent consistency piece. Since the engine is very small, the deck can run tons of hand traps. Since the other monsters special themselves out of the hand if you control another, you can play around hand traps somewhat better than a lot of other decks on this list. Machine Duplication is also insane for the deck. Link monsters enable easy OTKs and can make this deck very strong. Spirals can also blend very well into this deck. Appliance Alliances can also blend very well into other machine decks, such as Cybele Dragons, or into some generic Link Spam decks. Spirals are a previously tier 10 deck that has been murdered by the ban list, quite thoroughly. But this deck isn't out of the running at all. A lot of the original combos the deck could take advantage of are still there, now just infinitely more bricky and a bit harder to start. Spiral focuses around Link spamming and only using cards like Spiral Quick Fix and Double Helix for easy combo extenders. The deck will make generic Link monsters like Apollosa and set up a Spiral Sleeper for easy disruption. With the way the deck is right now, it's incredibly vulnerable to hand traps. Most decks will fix this problem by combining Spirals with another engine, such as Scraps or Gizmex. Spirals are a glass cannon deck at the moment, and if they ever get Spiral Master Plan back, the deck immediately jumps up to Rogue status, if not higher. Fabled are a complex combo deck, all about having your monsters get discarded for value. This deck's got some truly insane inboards, and it works very well with meta engines, such as Destroyer, Phoenix Enforcer, and the Adventure engine. But there's a pretty big downside to having to discard your entire hand for plays, and that's that the deck is extremely fragile and does not play nice into hand traps. More than that, running all the discard fodder is very bricky and can brick quite a lot. It's yet another glass cannon combo deck, albeit with a slightly more consistent strategy and a very strong inboard. Ancient Gears are a very simple OTK fusion deck. Switch out key cards at your normal summons and link monsters, use your spell cards to give your monsters and combos protection, make big boys in OTK easily. This deck works fantastic with Earth Machine support, and Ancient Guild Fusion sets up all your fusion monsters. The downside is it's a very simple strategy. The deck doesn't do a lot going first, the deck is somewhat vulnerable to negates. The deck is also not perfectly consistent. It is a very solid, simple, classic OTK deck as it is. That's it for Tier 4. That's 62 decks covered in Tier 4, plus the 61 I missed in the lower tiers. I tried to go in a bit more detail with each of these decks to cover more of what each deck does. This video is going a bit long, so I'm going to call it for this part of the video. This project has taken more time than I'd wanted it to, but I hope you all liked the video. Please subscribe. This video took a painful amount of time and work, and I want you all to be ready for when Part 3 comes out. Lastly, before I go, I made a Discord server. Y'all can join if you want to talk about card games, see and vote for what videos I'm working on next, or just chat. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.